Hi, so today I will be presenting on the theorist Catherine Bell. Some notable points in her life. She was born in 1953 and she died on May 23rd, 2008. She received her BA in philosophy and religion, and a year later, in 1976, her master's in history of religions from the University of Chicago Divinity School. And then in 1983, she received her PhD from the same school. In 1982 to 1983, she did research in Japan and Taiwan, which was funded by various awarded scholarships or fellowships. She was also a fellow at the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where she was involved in their Chinese popular culture project. She got a position 2 years later at Santa Clara University in the Religious Studies department, where her research was devoted to Chinese ritual, focusing on Chinese religions and ritual studies. She would receive an award for excellence over a decade later in curriculum innovation when working at Santa Clara University to restructure the Religious Studies department curriculum there. In 1998, she became the professor of the Bernard Hanley Professor of Religious Studies, and 2 years later, the chair of the Religious Studies Department. In that same year, 2000, she was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, and those health issues would lead to her retirement in 2005, where she then continued to research until her death in 2008. Works by Bell specifically pointed out her essay performance from 1998 is pointed out in Nye as one of her most accessible reads for her theories and methodologies, and also her entry in the Blackwell Companion to the Study of Religions from 2006. But the key well-known two main books by her are Ritual Theory, Ritual Practice, 1992, and Ritual Perspectives and Dimensions, 1997. These are the two main works that her methodology comes from, discussed in Nye in the presentation and also by her critics. Other works are listed on the right as well. So her influences, she was influenced in part by those she disagreed with, which is on the left, those whom she critiqued. But also she adapted different concepts and terms that will be brought up later from various scholars. They would range across discipline and across countries. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, feminist theorist Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray, cognitive scientist George Lakoff, the American philosopher Frederick Jameson, the French philosopher Paul Michel Foucault, and the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. So she would adapt or derive her different concepts or key terms that she used in her theory from these other scholars, from these other disciplines, and then add on to them as well. So her methodology, as obvious by the influences on the previous slide, she had an interdisciplinary perspective because she recognized the limits of theory variety in each field and adapted concepts from there. Her theory is called practice theory. So rituals, while not all religious, highlights religion to be viewed as a practice, not only or limited to belief. And this idea of rituals and belief being a part of a dichotomy that is viewed as fundamental by traditional theorists. She had an issue with. Bell did not think that such dichotomies were fundamental, and so she focused on the separation of belief and ritual, but prioritized ritual, which is where rites could be viewed as text. She did not agree with this, and that I think in part comes from the interdisciplinary, because some of the philosophers mentioned on the previous slide were also literary critics and would obviously use their techniques from their interdisciplinary knowledge themselves in their own works. She did not think there were universal definitions, but she did think that ritual action could be split up into 4 categories listed here as a part of priority of practice over meaning. And this was a part of considering ritual as strategic practice, which related to the power relationship that she built off the other theorists, in which participating in certain rituals would give power to authorities, or the submission of a participant in the ritual would create another power dynamic. And then some critics of hers comment on, because she has this focus on rituals, that it is difficult to know her opinion on beliefs, and that she doesn't go in depth into what she considers belief or what her theory on belief would be. But that was actually one of the things that she was working on. Her unfinished manuscript, that is said to be as long as a book when she died, was about belief, and belief as an embodied practice and a habit of thought, rather than, again, fighting against the dichotomy that has been more modern of the mind versus body problem. So key terms, as has been mentioned multiple times, ritual. So Bell actually had an issue with ritual, as it was ambiguous and hard to define, similar to what Nye says about religion as well. So it is a little bit funny that she uses it in so many of her paper and book titles. But she instead talks about ritualization, or a sense of ritualization, as a way of thinking and action, and an alternative focus on ritual as a mediator or expressor through action, making it an active role in a religion and a practice to be focused on, rather than something to be glossed over in favor of looking at beliefs or belief system. So, as previously mentioned, one of her influences, Peter Bourdieu, has a term called habitus, which particularly is summarized in Nye as habitus describes the outline and the context in which such thought, action, practice occurs. It is the actual cultural place and places in which people do their cultural and religious lives. And that is page 125 to 126. The quote here is specifically as Bell refers to it in Ritual Theory, Ritual Practice, that first key book that I mentioned from 1992. 2 more terms. So the social body, or the notion of the socio-biological body. Bell expands her notion of the social body as influenced from the various scholars we've talked about before, such as Pierre Bourdieu, Julia Kristov, Louis Igari, George Lakoff, and I think that's it. But so she expands upon them in order to include the agency in daily practices that coordinate conceptual and physical knowledges. And she actually, in her methodological argument, shifts the question of agency away from focus on the agent and towards religious practices. So, quoting Keller, she argues for a shift away from the category of ritual to an analysis of the practice of bodies when their activities are making distinctions that are privileged as more powerful or more special than mundane practices, and that in part comes back to the dichotomy that she disliked, in this case being between the mundane and profound, I think. I'm not quite sure. There's also homogeny, and she does, which is based off of Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony. And so she is specifically talking about redemptive hegemony as a characteristic of practice realization that has to do with the motivational dynamics of agency, the will to act, which is also integral to the concept of action. So we're coming down again to rituals as active action and a focus on then religious practice through the actions of these rituals. So overall conclusions on religions from Bell is that religion was an array of, or is an array of embodied practices, and she thought it was critical. She was critical of assumptions and hidden biases, which she felt were made through the dichotomy and the sort of quickly moving past rituals by giving them a meaning or a symbol to them. And it still cannot be universally defined or isn't absolute, just as we talked about with the term ritual itself. As we have also discussed, the power relationship through ritual practice, the agency shift from the action of these rituals, and she influenced from, it seems like, Nye's writing on rituals, as well as Keller, who is a source, and overall between her restructuring of the curriculum back in 1996 and even now, the influence of that shift of focus from beliefs to rituals is pretty big. So critiques of her. So some critiques can be applied to this group called the Davidsonian critics, which originated with Donald Davidson, and a lot of that had to do with they're wanting to focus on not only the dichotomy, but linguistics specifically, looking at a sentence level of the rituals, whereas Bell wanted to look more at big picture and what was going on socially, and like she talks about with power dynamics, where you bring in political aspects. Critics of practice theory, which is essentially what her methodology could be summarized as, targeted as being too skeptical or exclusive, and criticize her not willing to restrict meanings to the same level as the Davidsonians talk about, as well as having issue with her placing priority on rituals over beliefs. So as talked about, religion is, in Bell's case, has more to do with a matter of practice, and it's a array of these embodied practices, rituals being prioritized in her theory, as well as focus on the power relationship. She herself critiques the dichotomies and has issue with the amount of weight, per se, that is placed on belief, and the same can be said back to her. And in conclusion, she builds on influences while going against traditional previous studies, and really shift not only with agency but with just the view, like has been repeated, from belief to religions. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and here's my works cited page.